Welcome to Historical Happy Hour, the podcast that explores new and exciting historical fiction. I'm your host, Jane Healy, and in today's episode, we welcome award-winning journalist and author Jack Ford to discuss his latest novel, Beyond This Place of Wrath and Tears. It's based on the true story of World War II reporter Lee Carson, and it released May 27th. Thank you, Jack. Thanks for doing this. Welcome.
Jane, it's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. I've seen several of these and they're always informative and entertaining. So I'm
Oh,
delighted to be a
thank you.
guest with you.
Thanks so much. I'm going to do a quick bio on you and then we will jump right in because I have probably too many questions. Will take up too much time. So, Ford is an author and journalist whose career as an American news personality has spanned more than 3 decades. Following his early career as a prominent trial attorney, he transitioned to television news and has worked as an anchor correspondent for NBC, ABC, CBS, ESPN, Court TV, and most recently hosted Metro Focus on PBS. He has received 3 Emmy Awards, a Peabody Award, 3 American Radio and Television Awards, a National Headliner Award, and a March of Dimes FDR Award. He is the author of 2 acclaimed historical fiction novels, Chariot on the Mountain, and his latest, Beyond This Place of Wrath and Tears, which we're going to talk about tonight. Again, welcome.
Jane, thank you so much.
Thank you. So, this is about war correspondent Lee Carson, and it's about her life before and during and after the war, after World War II. How did you learn about her, and how did you end up deciding to write a novel about her?
Well, as an author yourself, historical fiction, some of yours centered on World War II. I've always been a bit of a student of World War II. I was a history major in college, and I read everything I can get my hands on. As a matter of fact, I'm delighted. I told you I just ordered 2 of your books.
Thank you.
So I'm thrilled to have them here. So I read everything I get my hands on. And one of my favorite authors, nonfiction writer, British writer by the name of Ben Macintyre. Ben
So good.
Macintyre, just a marvelous chronicler, right, of World War II. And his books tell the stories of the deceptions that the Allies engaged in to try to put the Nazis off in terms of where D-Day was going to be taking place. They're just fascinating books. And I was reading his most recent one. This is a couple of years ago now. And it's called Colditz, and it's about the Colditz Castle, which was a 1300s fortress in Austria and was utilized by the Germans during World War II as a prisoner of war camp for high value prisoners. High value meant basically ones that kept trying to escape from other prisoner of war camps. And also, toward the end, it became the location that they used for the big name prisoners. So Churchill's nephew was held there. The son of the US ambassador to Great Britain was held there. So it was a fascinating place. And just the structure itself, 12-foot thick concrete walls were interesting. So the book basically chronicles the story of through the 5 years of the European war about Colditz Castle and how it was used. And towards the end, I get to the chapter where it's being liberated by Allied troops, by American troops. And he wrote in the book, he said, as the enormous open doors swung open, he said there was nearly a riot because walking in with the Allied troops was this, his words, smashing looking American war correspondent, Lee Carson. And he talked about the fact that literally her being there, and she was, by all accounts, extraordinarily beautiful. Also, by all accounts, extraordinarily smart, fearless, charming. So he devoted almost a full chapter to talking about her and some of her history and some backgrounds. And my first response was, this is fascinating. Why don't I know anything about Lee Carson? And as you know, as a writer, when you come across something like that that fascinates you, you want to learn more. So I started doing
Totally.
research, found some books that were written right about a year or two after the end of the war, talking about the various correspondents there. Curiously, there were only a handful of women, right? And it's, and even those women there were enormous restrictions put on them. Originally, they were told you can't go to the front lines, and they'd say, well, we have to report from the front lines. They said, no, you're women. You can't be up there. You can't go any farther than the hospitals. Lee Carson broke all those rules, as did many of the other women. So I found some books talking about her, and I discovered she had died fairly young, in her like 51, 52 years old. No children, so no direct heirs to fan the flames of her legacy. But I was also struck by how successful she'd been as a reporter. She received a Medal of Honor that went to reporters, not the Congressional Medal of Honor, but a different one,
Hmm.
Journalistic Medal of Honor. And it was interesting, Jane, you'll appreciate this. I found her obit in the New York Times. It was 2 paragraphs. And I thought, how could that be? And my
Right.
first thought was, if she passed away today with that kind of background, she'd be a half a page of the New York Times, maybe more.
Hmm.
So it struck me, and immediately I said, you know what? I got to tell her story. I'd find out more about her because this is a story that needs to be told.
Hmm. Yeah, it's amazing when you find those lesser known people. I mean, we were just talking, like I've written 3 World War II novels. I had vaguely heard of her, but really didn't know anything about her. And I read the obituary you included in your press materials, and it's shocking. It's shocking that she's not more well known.
Yeah, yeah. Because if you look at what she did, and this is it's fiction, historical fiction. You know, the essence of it, the incidents are true. They all happened. Everything I have her doing in this book, she actually did. She was there. And
Right.
I said to somebody, she was kind of the Forrest Gump of
I was
that era of
thinking that
reporting.
when yeah,
Yeah,
that's so funny. I
right.
almost put that down. I'm like, is that insulting to her? But
Yes,
yeah, she
yeah.
almost was.
She was everywhere. So in telling her story, I kept those core events. I used many of the actual characters that were with her. I changed some names. Some are composites. A couple I had to create just to kind of move the narrative along. But I think probably the best thing was the most helpful thing for me was that I was able to get access through a newspaper archive to dozens of her dispatches that she had written from the front lines. And she has an interesting style. She's very kind of first person and slang, and makes you feel you're right with her, in the Jeep while you're ducking this aerial bombardment. So I think finding a little bit more of who she was from some other people's biographies and writings, and then finding her writings gave me a glimpse into her soul. As you know, as a writer, you can learn a lot about somebody by reading what they wrote.
Hmm. Yeah.
So it allowed me to start getting a fuller picture of who this mysterious and undoubtedly heroic woman was.
Absolutely. And that actually you answered my next question, which is, how did you find her voice and figure out how to write and like really get to know Lee Carson as enough that you could write a story centered around her life. And because it's hard, and especially when she's lesser known. She wasn't famous, and so there's
Right?
less out there. But one thing I appreciated too, you sprinkled articles throughout the book
No,
that,
I'm glad you enjoyed that.
yeah. So are those actually her articles, or are they?
They are. They
Okay.
are. There are
Amazing.
one or two. So again, what I did is, yeah, again, sort of her bio, extraordinarily intelligent. She started Smith College when she was 14 years old.
Amazing.
Dropped out after 2 years old because she wanted to be a journalist. Fearless. Spent. Folks have heard of the Battle of the Bulge. One of the last great battles of World War II. She was there on the front line. She spent Christmas Eve, Christmas Day in a foxhole with soldiers ducking artillery. She was charming. She
Mhm.
realized in order to get access to stories, sometimes she had to flat out charm people. And as I said before, she received an award from the Washington D.C. A journalist organization as the best looking correspondent in D.C. So she had all of those features that contributed to who she was and what she did. But again, as you know, when you're trying to write realistically, you have a backdrop, factual backdrop for World War II. So I had these battles, I had all of these things that she was involved with, certainly. But then I had to figure out, how do I weave her into it? And it was her writings, and her
Mm.
voice. As you said, it's essential to find her voice. So I sprinkled throughout the book when I'd be talking about an episode. She and a couple of other journalists discovered the smoking wreck of a Nazi work camp that nobody knew existed. They were out looking for a munitions plant, and they literally stumble across the smoking wreckage, and just the horrible, terrible nature of this, and some survivors. And in reading what she wrote, you could get a sense of how she felt. She struggled to remain somebody who was objective all the time, but you could see sometimes she lost that objectivity because it was
Mhm.
her own personal humanity. So I have the article she wrote after that finding there. So I try to sprinkle the articles amongst each of the chapters where she wrote about what we're either going to now read about ourselves or just read about. There were one or two which I actually had to create
Okay.
just to kind of stitch the story together. And I was actually quite proud because I mentioned in the acknowledgments, my wife has been married 50 years. And
Oh,
she worked to put me through law school, and and all, and she's my first editor. Every
wow.
thought, every idea, every word she looks at. And there were a couple of the articles, and when she read them, she didn't recognize them as that I wrote them.
Oh,
And
nice.
she said, "Oh, this is another one from Lee." And I said, "Ah, oh, thank you." I said, "You
Yes.
could not have given me a greater compliment that thinking that what I wrote just sounded like something that Lee Carson would have written."
Oh, that's excellent. So good. So tell me, or actually tell the audience, because I read the story. You talked about her being like the Forrest Gump of the European theater of operations. Like, talk about, so she was, among other things, she flew over the invasion sites at the start of D-Day. What are some of the other things that she, like historical moments she witnessed? I thought
And
that was
again,
amazing.
again, if I had made all of these up, you probably would have said, "Yeah, that's kind of a lot, really."
Right.
But the
Yeah.
reality is, every one of these instances, she was there. So we mentioned she talked herself onto a bomber flying over the D-Day beaches. There were no correspondents at the beaches on D-Day. They came in shortly afterwards. So again, she charmed herself onto it, and actually was written up on charges by the Allied forces because she broke the rules to do that, and she had to kind of talk her way out of it. She had a couple of instances where she was charged with violating the rules of correspondence. So that was one that she got to do. She was among there was now a lot of people have claimed to have been the first ones into liberated Paris.
Mm,
But what I wrote seemed to substantiate the claim that she and two men, two reporters, were indeed the first ones into liberated Paris the day before it was liberated. So
amazing.
they were shot at by Nazi snipers. They got in the middle of partisan battles between French forces, the French partisan forces. And what was interesting about this is that I mentioned to you the rules were for the women, you can't go past where the hospitals. Well, Lee Carson broke that rule, as did a couple of other women. They got in trouble for it, but they continued to do that. And they said, how can we tell the American public what's happening on the front lines if we're not there? Somebody has to tell us first. So she did that. What I found was astonishing is a day or two before the liberation of Paris, as Allied troops were driving towards, and they set up on the outskirts of Paris, and all the journalists were sort of in a pack. They were all put up in a hotel, by the Allied forces. And then the night before, the Allied forces locked up all the female correspondents in the hotel, and they said, "We're doing this for your own safety. We're not going to allow you to get into Paris until it's safe." As you can imagine, these were some strong-willed women. And
Mm,
Lee Carson was one of them out front saying, "What do you mean? Not safe. We haven't been safe since we landed on D-Day. We're okay with it. That's our job." But talk about a bit of rampaging sexism. The forces said, "No, no, no. We got to protect the women. You can't go
mhm.
there." Lee Carson broke out. She
Amazing.
she escaped from the hotel, tagged up with two other male journalists that she was friends with, and they're in a jeep, and they're by most accounts the first ones into Paris. So that's one of her sort of Forrest Gump locations. She and Ernest Hemingway. This is really funny because I keep relating these stories to my wife when I'm finding them. And at one point in time, my wife said, "I can't believe that she didn't run into Hemingway at some
Right.
point in time." And plus, she was gorgeous. So if you run
Yeah,
into Hemingway and you're a gorgeous woman, he's going to hit on you.
absolutely.
Literally the next day, I find a story written by one of her friends talking about how she and Hemingway and a couple of other journalists were almost captured by the Nazis in a farmhouse that they were staying in on the way into Paris. So, that's a story that's true. I had Hemingway hitting on her, not
Mhm.
surprisingly there. That part I added to it. She was with the American troops when they crossed the Rhine. Now that was a huge deal in the drive towards Berlin because
Mhm.
now Allied troops were in the heartland of Germany. And it was a battle to get over. They couldn't find a bridge. People might have heard if you've read up on World War II, you might know about the bridge at Remagen, which is the bridge that was utilized by Allied troops. They thought they were going to have to build a bridge because they believed that all the bridges had been destroyed either by Allied bombing or by the retreating Germans. And she was there with American troops when they quite literally stumbled on the bridge at Remagen. They come over a hill and they look down and they say, it's still standing, but they had to
Mm.
take it. So she's there in the battle lines of taking the bridge at Remagen to enter into Rhine. She was there and actually got arrested when the Allied troops met up with the Soviet troops. And this was marking the end for Germany when they met up together.
Mhm.
And they met up. She was part of there were festivities like banquets, and they talked about all the Russians and throwing down the vodka shots. She and another reporter decided, we got to try to get to Berlin by ourselves. So they actually borrow the term they used, what had been a Nazi staff car that had been repainted with Allied paintings and a flag. And the two of them are driving, trying to get through to Berlin. And they've got fighting Russian forces, the retreating German forces on either side of them. And they actually had to get saved by Russian forces, and they arrested them because they were thinking, these are the frontline troops. They're saying, here's somebody in a car that looks like a Nazi staff car. They're swearing to us that they're American reporters, but, we're not so sure. So once again, she finds herself being arrested trying to get into Berlin. So, all of these significant events, she was there and was there as a force.
Yeah, and it's like you said, stranger than fiction, like
Yeah.
so gutsy, so brave. There was a scene I enjoyed towards the beginning of the book that I wanted to ask if it was true or not, where she has an encounter with Winston Churchill. Was that
Yeah. That
fictionalized
that
or that
one
was
was
true?
yeah, that one was something that I created, but it was based on the fact that Winston Churchill embraced the media. He understood the power of the media. Winston Churchill
Mm,
was a writer. If you remember, during the Boer War, he was covering the Boer War and was captured. And it was the basis for his own book, movies afterwards, where he escaped from a prisoner of war camp and had to travel across South Africa to be liberated himself. So Churchill embraced the media and was willing to say yes to female reporters there.
hmm.
So, I found in some of her writings and some of the writings of others that they viewed Churchill as an ally, somebody who would get them out there. Because interestingly, in the Pacific Theater, General Douglas MacArthur would allow no women to report.
Hmm.
No women whatsoever were allowed in the Pacific Theater. So Churchill actually came out and said in a number of edicts, yes, we need reporters on the front lines. And yes, it's fine for us to have female reporters. If they're good to do their job, I don't care whether male or female. So I took that and took a little bit of literary license and
Yeah,
created what I think could have happened and what it
absolutely.
would have sounded like and looked like if she indeed had encountered Winston Churchill. But I'm glad you liked the scene. It was one of my favorite ones.
Yeah, and that's I think that's what's so great about historical fiction. I always say, like, if it didn't happen, is it authentic to the time and the place and the history? Like, then
Yep.
put it in to create a better narrative. So
Exactly. If it didn't
yeah,
happen, might it have?
yes, exactly.
And does it sound and feel consistent with the
Yeah,
reality of history? Yeah.
totally. I want to ask about the structure, because this is a dual timeline narrative. And it starts actually in the post-war years in the 1950s when she's living in DC. And then she's kind of recounting her life during the war. But you said that you took more license, you fictionalized her life post-war, more than you did, during her World War II accounts. So talk her life during World War II. So talk about why you decided to reimagine her life after the war in this way.
This was an interesting development because originally I was writing it just focusing on her time in World War II. And as I got it to my publisher and my editor, and we were sitting and talking, and one of them had an idea and said, we know that her post-war career was not what she would have wanted it to be. She was a woman at the in the back end of World War II, and as we know, women stepped up in World War II. Now, historians will tell you we could not have been successful in winning that war without the efforts of women across the board.
Mm-hmm.
But historians will also tell you when the war was over and the men came back, they got most of the big jobs. We've heard various stories about women who were so successful, and all of a sudden they're told, we don't need you anymore. So she comes back, and she's not getting the big stories anymore. She's still writing, but she's doing profiles and things. And this is a woman who was in foxholes,
Mm-hmm.
under artillery bombardment. So, one of the folks in my publisher said, what do we think it might have been, if she had gotten the opportunity to do more when she went back? And so I started giving it some thought. And I thought, she's back and the Cold War is now raging. She's back in DC, an epicenter of the Cold War. And again, I had studied some of this, and I know you've got, some stuff on the Cold War that you've written about. And I thought, Cold War, DC, espionage, right? And then I used some actual characters. I changed some names, but some folks who were revealed to have been involved in espionage in DC during the trial of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. There was a woman called the Red Spy Queen. And I've taken her and given her a little bit of a different identity here, but I have her reaching out to Lee Carson, who's now back, in the 50s in DC, and saying to her, I have information about a very high up espionage ring. Meet me here if you want to know, at the Washington Monument.
Mm-hmm.
And so I decided I'm going to bracket this. I'm going to start with the Cold War part of it. And she gets thrown into this investigation. And the investigation, we know, again, if you've studied the Cold War, you've heard the expression about the Cambridge Five. And these were people who were students at Cambridge in the 20s and the 30s, when communism was viewed very differently from the way it was viewed in the Cold War. I teach an undergraduate seminar at Yale, I have for 18 years now, about famous trials. And we do the Rosenberg trial. And I say to my students, I said, if you were students here at Yale in the 1930s, there was a Yale Young Communist Club organization, colleges, universities around the country, especially coming out of the Depression. People were saying, is there a better socioeconomic system for us than capitalism that could take care of everybody? So there was an attraction to communism in the 20s and 30s. And idealism, which we learned afterwards just didn't exist in practice in communist societies. But if you know anything about the Cambridge Five, they were 5 illustrious Cambridge students who went on to important positions in the British government. And for decades, they were Soviet spies. Some of them were captured, some of them just escaped. And I thought, maybe, how about if there's a Cambridge 6? How about if we have somebody else, but he's in the American system, diplomatic system? And so that was the foundation for saying, let's thrust her into, with all of her wartime skills and curiosity and fearlessness, let's thrust her into this espionage investigation to start the book. And then it shifts in storytelling as she's telling somebody's asking her about what she did. It shifts then to the middle portion of the book, a little bit, the bulk of it. It takes us back to her wartime exploits. And then it comes out of that and wraps up with this espionage ring and what happens. It's an imagining by me, as opposed to the bulk of the book, which is World War II, which is all based on actual events. It's an imagining, but once again, it's I felt like I knew her. And that's what you want, as a writer, you want to really feel like these characters you're creating, that they're part of you, know them, what they think and what they act and what they'd say. And so, I felt this would have been her if she was given the opportunity here.
Yes.
So let's kind of bracket the World War II stories with what might have been for her for journalism career.
Yeah, no, I thought I loved that twist in it, but it was interesting when I first read the summary of the book and it said a reimagining of her life after the war during the early Cold War years. I was thinking like a complete reimagining, but a lot of like the history of those early Cold War years is based in fact, like Elizabeth Bentley, who Lee connects with.
Elizabeth
Yeah, the
Bentley is the
spy.
character that I've
Yeah, so
sort
as
of
an
created.
American
It's a little different.
who was a Russian spy,
Yep,
so
yep.
yeah, I would just in this world for my next book, early Cold War DC. So I was like, oh, we should do an event. If you ever come up here this way,
That's
I
right.
could
We will
do
do that.
something.
We will
Yeah,
do
yeah.
that. Love to.
Yeah, it was a fascinating time in US history, and I think it's one I think people enjoy learning about the early Cold War years in America because there was a lot going on that I think people have forgotten about. So
People, and especially young people, I will
yes.
say to my students, my Yale students are, 22 years old, 21, 22 years old. I grew up as a child in the Cold War, and I'll say to them, you all don't understand. The fear, the anxiety of living in that era, an era of mutually assured destruction, mad. The notion
Hmm.
that if somebody fires up a nuclear weapon, somebody else is going to retaliate and the world will disappear. I say to them, you all as students have had fire drills, right, in grammar school, where the alarm goes off and you go outside in the parking lot until another alarm goes off and you go back into school. I said, we had nuclear bomb drills. Literally,
Hmm.
I remember in third grade, the alarm goes off and we're hiding under our desks. I'm in Jersey City, New Jersey in third grade. And I say to them, I recall even then asking myself a couple of questions. Why did the Russians want to bomb Jersey City first? And secondly, is this quarter-inch of plywood over my head really going to protect me if the Russians are in fact bombing Jersey City? So the fear and the anxiety of the time was palpable. We lived under it. Rational people who built survival places in their basements and stocked them
Hmm.
for years. So it's a time that, sort of academically, people now can look back at. But if you live through it, you realize how powerful and compelling and frightening that time
Hmm.
was to make all of this then realistic when you try to tell this story.
Yeah, yeah. So I love that you bring in like both timelines in both parts of history. I think people will really enjoy that. I have a question. Um, Explain the origins. I know what they are, but of
Yes.
the title Beyond This Place of Wrath and Tears to people. And I
So
wonder if you came up with that, or your publisher, or it was kind of collaborative.
actually, I'm going to take credit for that. The
Nice.
working title was called The Rhine Maiden because it's
Mm.
one of the titles, if you would, that she got. She was called the D-Day Dame for flying
Mhm.
over. She became a celebrity. I found these articles in Time magazine written about her during the war. She would repeatedly be mentioned in Walter Winchell's radio broadcast, which Walter Winchell was like the consummate, the kind of Hollywood entertainment. If Walter Winchell mentioned you, you were up in the stratosphere. So she became a bit of a celebrity. So we were using the Rhine Maiden as a working title. And we were getting close, and somebody had said, well, if somebody doesn't know the story, are they going to think this is about a German woman? Because the Rhine Maiden comes from a Wagner opera, all right?
Yeah.
And the characters in a Wagner opera. So then we started working through it. And I don't know about you, but I found some of the hardest things to do about writing novels is coming up with the right title,
Oh, so hard.
right?
Yeah.
Isn't it? It's
Yeah.
so hard. That and coming up with the names of characters,
Hmm.
to make it sound right. So we kicked through a bunch of different ones and nobody was sold on any of them. Somebody said, I got a great one. And I'd say, or I suggest another one and they would say, So finally my editor who did a wonderful job, Elizabeth Trout, and again, the people at Kensington have been just delighted. This is my second book with them and they've just been, they're smart, they're thoughtful, they're
Hmm.
supportive, they do everything you want a publisher to do. And so someone had said, I think it was Elizabeth said, can we find something a little bit more poetic? We talked about, all the light we cannot see, so
Hmm.
a
Hmm.
poetic title. And I said, all right, give me some time. Let me see what I can do with that. So I started jumping into World War I, World War II poetry. There was a great deal of poetry that came out of World War I.
Hmm.
Some very famous writers, some of whom died in World War I. Wasn't finding anything great, and just was kind of just weaving through things to find something. And I came across the poem Invictus. People may well be familiar with the Invictus Games. Prince
Mhm.
Harry's been involved with them, and they are sporting events for warriors, most of them wounded warriors. And I find the Invictus poem, and it was written in the 1850s in Britain, and it was all about this notion of how do we get over the hurdles and the fears and the dangers of our life, and became apparently something that was part of the curriculum for British school kids. Invictus, you had to read. And people might remember the last lines talking about the master of my fate, the captain of my soul, type of thing. But in the middle of it, I find a paragraph that reads, beyond this place of wrath and tears, and it talks about how we need to get past the shadows so that we can survive. And I
Mhm.
thought, wow, that's it.
Mm.
That's it, because Lee Carson felt the death and the destruction and the loss of young lives, and the physical destruction she would see of villages and cities, and she felt that, and you could see it in her writings. And my thought was, okay, she's lived through all this, as with the soldiers. I dedicate this book to my father-in-law, Neil Kelly, who
Okay.
landed
Yeah.
the third wave of D-Day.
Wow.
Got into a couple of weeks into it, and then was seriously wounded in the Battle of Saint-Lô, lost part of his hand, was in a hospital for almost a year afterwards. But and he never talked about it.
No.
And
No.
those members of the greatest generation, my colleague Tom Brokaw, when I was at NBC News, did the book The Greatest Generation.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the people he wrote about, I knew, was from my hometown. And the interesting thing is, I didn't know that this man, who I knew very well, had led the charge on the D-Day landings at Pont de Hoc, which is the cliff overlooking where everybody said, if we don't take out the guns there, this invasion is doomed to failure. And this guy was the one who went up the cliffs and took them out. And I never knew it. So, that generation didn't talk about it at all. So, but they struggled with it after.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I thought, I am sure that Lee Carson struggled with what she saw, and the dead bodies, and the smoking remains of this concentration camp with the bodies strewn all about, that she and these people actually discovered. And I thought, how do you get through that? And that's when I thought, you know what? You need to get beyond this place of wrath and tears. So
Mm-hmm.
I sent it out to my publishers. And I said, guys, I think I got it. And so we scheduled a Zoom meeting like this, and I thought to myself, what do I do if they don't like it? Because you know what, I'm sold on it now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And publishing is a collaborative effort, and you
Mm-hmm.
work, and I'm thinking, I wonder if I'm gonna have, do I have to dig in my heels on this? How am I gonna handle this? And I was so delighted we all got on the screen. And I said, what do you think? And everybody's like, yes.
Oh, great.
So it
That's
took a
good.
long time to find it, but I'm glad you like it, and I think it really captures what we're talking about here.
Yeah. And it's memorable, which I think is the most important thing
Good,
for
good.
titles,
Yes,
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. I
absolutely.
have a few writing questions. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. It's already 7:30, almost 7:35.
I'm having a great time with this
Well, thank you. I
conversation.
know we
You
could
take
just chat and chat.
we could do this forever. You just tell me what time you need, and I'm happy to do it.
Okay, so I have some writing questions that if you've listened, I ask all the writers that come on
Hmm.
here. And
Yep.
then if anyone in the audience has questions, please put them in the chat or the Q&A for Jack. So I love to ask about writing process because it's so different for every writer. So are you a plotter? Do you plot things out, or do you write by the seat of your pants? Are you somewhere in
No,
between?
I'm somewhere in between. I have sort of, as if it's a map, I have destination points. I
Yeah.
know I want to get here, I want to get there. And then
Hmm.
I sit down and I start to write. And I say, let's get to how am I going to get to that point? So
Hmm.
I got some friends who are writers who have detailed outlines. I don't. And when I found, sometimes I think I'm getting from point A to point B, and then I realize, no, that's not where I want to go. This is not where this is taking me. I got to go to another point first before I can get there. So that's the way I write. I've got destinations, I've got sort of thoughts in my mind, and then I sort of work through it. I don't know if you've probably, I know you've done this too. The question for a lot of writers is, when do you write best? How do you write best? I have the writer John Grisham is a good friend of mine. I interviewed him. I used to host the Today Show on the weekends back in the late '90s when he was just coming out. So I had
Right.
him on the station. We became friends. We both had similar backgrounds. We were both practicing lawyers. I got into journalism. He got into writing. And I remember talking with him about it. And he said, you know what? You got to find out what time of the day you write best. John said he gets up in the morning, 6 o'clock. He writes from 6 to 12 every
Hmm.
day, and then takes the rest of the day off. And he writes. He'll do a book. He'll turn out a book in 6 months. Then he'll take 6 months off and do it after. I mean, it's his full time occupation. I'm still working as a journalist, so that's not what I was doing. But I discovered I write better in the afternoons.
Hmm.
In the mornings, I've got things I want to do and get out of the way. And then I'd find, okay, now I'm ready to sit down. I have a room with a fireplace. We close the doors, and I'll work from 2 o'clock to it might be 6 o'clock or so. And again, one of the problems is because of still being a working journalist, not as much now as I used to, obviously, as my career is sort of winding down. But there were times when I'd have to walk away from it, and I might be away from it for a week. I might be traveling, doing something else. And I'd always take a notebook with me. And, I had a combination of working on my computer, and I have a ton of legal pads that I would fill out handwritten. I'd be on a plane or in a hotel or something, and I'd say, oh, I got an idea. And I'd start filling pages and pages. I probably have 20 legal pads, in the big binder for the book where I filled out every page and writing in addition to this. And I also found that it was a good editing process for me. Because then I'd
Hmm.
sit down with the legal pages and I start to sort of transpose them on the computer. And I'd say, no, I got to change this. This is not we're going to do this. So again, for me, I'm not the early morning crank out, a bunch of hours right away. Right better in the afternoon. Just found a good spot. Somebody had said to me, find the right spot. So in the cold weather, this room, I put a fire in the fireplace. We live about a block from the ocean on the Atlantic coast in New Jersey. The old 100-year-old house, and I found a spot on the porch, rockers, and I'd sit there and I'd do some writing there. So it's kind of the way it evolved for me as a writer.
Nice, nice, excellent. Um, what is your favorite part of the writing process, and what is the part you like the least?
Really good questions. Um, I think I do a lot of editing while I'm writing. Other
Mhm.
writers have different approaches. Some of them they'll just write everything and then start editing. But I literally go back chapter by chapter and do editing as I go. And it's the joy of when I'd go back to a chapter and I'd look at it, I'd say, all right, this is pretty good, but I can make it better. And I do some things with it, and then I'd sit back and say, that's it.
Mhm.
I've got that chapter. So since I do sort of editing on the fly in the middle of it, for me being able to sit back and say, good, that one's done. Let's move on to the next one.
Mhm.
I think the editing that I do with my editors, and look, I'm a collaborative journalist. I did stories for 60 Minutes, for many years, and 60 Minutes Sports, and 60 Minutes most collaborative involvement I've ever had. We would do for a 60 minute story, and if you watch it, this because see the
Oh
quality
yeah.
of it. 15, 20-minute story, long form for television. We would have, I think the last story I did, we had 13 different scripts, revisions of scripts for this.
Wow.
And we did 4 different screenings of it. And after each screening, you do screening in 60 minutes, you got a room full of people. So it's me, it's my producer, it's the editor, and then it's sort of the higher ups, and then other editors and producers, because we want impact from people who are not working on the story. And after the screening, you get all these ideas, and you had to be thick skinned and say, this is all about making the story better. And it was. And it's the same thing about the editing process. It's what a great editor does, as you know. And I remember somebody telling me, a writer saying, look, I don't want an editor who's trying to make this their story. If the editor wants a story, go write your own book.
Mhm.
I want an
Mhm.
editor who's going to take my story and make it better. So the editing is invaluable, but when it comes back to me and it's like, okay, we got it all marked up and all these things, and now on the computer, you get all the red lines and this, and you type in things, and so I'm past the creative process, and now involved with, all right, does this word really work here? Do you need
Mhm.
to cut this down a little bit? Does this scene, can we do something with this? And I recognize it's essential. Good editing is essential to good writing. but it's a little bit burdensome. I don't know if you share it with me or not, but that's kind of the way I look at, which is why, I've been blessed with marvelous editors and again, the people I work with at Kensington. So, it's the right thing to do and they're good at it, but it can be a little bit burdensome.
Oh yeah, I agree. I mean, my editors, I've been really lucky and they're rarely wrong. But when I first get those editorial notes back, I always say I run screaming from the room and
Right.
like I just
Yeah.
need a day to let them
Yes, you do. I did the same thing. It's like, wait, isn't this good? Aren't we
Is it
saying this is
perfect?
okay? How can this be good? I've got so many notes here to do it. And
Yeah,
then
yeah,
what you realize is because it is good, but we'll make it better through
exactly,
that.
exactly.
Yeah.
Um, just a couple more questions. What advice, this is a two-part question, can you
Yeah.
give aspiring writers about the writing process, about writing in general, and what can you give them advice about getting published? What
Yeah.
advice
So
can you give them about getting
So
published?
starting with the writing process, and I'll go back to an interest story, and again, it comes back to John Grisham. I don't want to sound like a name dropper, but
Oh,
he happens to be a friend, so literally for years after I first met him, we would talk, and I'd say, what, John, I got an idea, for a book and stuff that I want to do, and whenever we bump into each other, he says, how's it coming? I said, oh, I haven't gotten started yet. And again, I'm working full time as a journalist. I'm jumping, I'm the chief legal correspondent for NBC News, so I'm jumping on planes to cover stories all over the country and doing
mhm.
other jobs over the years. And so the first good advice he gave to me was, Jack, I'm telling you this as a friend. Stop talking about it and start writing.
Oh, so good.
Right? Isn't it? Because everybody's thinking about, oh, I've got an idea, let's do this. He said, start writing. Figure it out. See how it goes. He had other advice when you talk about your writing. He had a great, and he said he got this from, I don't know, maybe it was Hemingway, saying, don't finish if you can help it at the end of a chapter and walk away from your computer or writing. He said, because then you got to come back. He said, especially with you, because I'd be away from it for days, maybe weeks.
Mhm.
He said, finish like 2/3 of the way through. So when you come back to it, you know how you're going to finish this. So you can
Yeah,
pick up the flow, right? And
yeah,
then
you
that
can get
carries
the
you into the
energy.
next one,
Yep, yep.
which was helpful. But in terms of what you write about, sometimes you hear people say, oh, you got to write about what you know. And that's a great idea. But I think you also might want to write about what you want to know.
Hmm.
And again, you have the same attraction to World War II in your writings that I have. Well, we didn't live through that, so we don't know it in that sense, but we're curious about it, and we're propelled by that curiosity. So I think the key to writing is your curiosity. Find what
Hmm.
you know, find what you're curious about, and then let that curiosity lead you to some answers to learn about it, and then you can write about it. So be guided and driven by your curiosity. Getting published is hard.
Hmm.
It's in this world, in this realm. So this is my fourth novel. The first one I did, and I liked it. I think it was good, and I look back at it now and say it was good. You get better, but then as with anything else, as more you write, the better you get. And I did one of the self-publishing companies, reputable.
Hmm.
Met with them, talked with them. I had a bit of an advantage because I was a national television journalist.
Hmm.
So I could get myself on the Today Show, to
Hmm.
talk about my book because I used to host the Today Show.
Hmm.
I had friends that were still doing that. But the first one's a struggle,
Hmm.
and but you don't want to give up. And again, and not to be name dropping, John Grisham will tell the story about his first book, which I think may well have been his best, right?
Oh, is this the time to kill?
Time to Kill.
One of my favorites.
Isn't it? It's just if folks who are listening to us, if you haven't read this,
Oh,
please go read it. It's
yes.
it's a fabulous book. He could not get it published. Couldn't get it published. Self-published it, put it in cartons in the trunk of his car, and go around the state of Mississippi, where he was
Hmm.
practicing a lawyer, and would go to book fairs and things and sell it out of the trunk of his car.
Hmm.
He couldn't get an agent, couldn't get a publisher. And then after that, got out there. And again, some people read it, others didn't. He found somebody who was willing to work as an agent. And that person said, all right, we got this book, Time to Kill. We'll use it as a writing sample. Do you have another story? And he said, yeah, I do. And the other story was The Firm, which we know, runaway bestseller,
Hmm.
unbelievable successful movie. So he had to keep after it to do it. Interestingly, then publishers came back and said, "Yeah, we're going to take that Time to Kill and we're going to reissue that, and give it, the
Yeah. Oh
marketing and
yeah.
publicity it needs." Yeah, but there's a guy, one of the most successful writing careers ever, couldn't get published.
Yep.
But what you say is, if you think it's worthwhile and if it's fulfilling, you keep after it. And you know what you do? You just get online. You find all the agents out there. Hard to do without an agent. You find all
Hmm.
the agents out there, and some of them will advertise looking for new writers.
Right.
And then you basically say, any one of them, here, I got this, here, read this, here, I'd love to talk to you about this. You get it out there, and you don't give up. And you see, and if you have to do that second time, if you think it's worthwhile, if you think what you have is good, then you do that. Ultimately, I got to Kensington, my publisher, for my last two books. And they've been the last one's called Chariot on the Mountain. Again, a similar story that I found, true life story about a woman in Virginia who had an enslaved woman who actually found her freedom in a courthouse in Virginia in 1846. And I remember saying, I'd never heard about
No.
that. And so that became the basis of that story. But I was fortunate to find a publisher who believed in what I did. They're great people, really smart. They know their job, and
Hmm.
they get really invested in it. So the advice I give to people, and I'll speak at journalism schools. I don't talk about television news journalism, and then I'll talk about writing. And I'll say to them, the key is you have to have a degree of perseverance and a
Hmm.
willingness to believe in yourself. And if it's good enough, somebody's going to find it for you.
Yes.
But you got to keep, used to be throwing things over the transom. That's an expression they still use in publishing, right? Because people would find the office of a publisher and they had those old glass transoms over the door, and they'd be open, and people would go by and just throw it over their manuscript and hope somebody would look at it on the floor and read it. Well, the today version of throwing a manuscript over the transom is, you find an agent or a publishing company, and you get it to them, and then you believe in what you do.
Absolutely. Such good advice. Before we wrap up, tell people where you're going to be touring in the next few months, because there's people from all over the country on tonight. So lovely. So tell, where are you going to be?
Yep. So the next few weeks, book came out last Wednesday. And I mentioned to you, I had a new shoulder put in literally 3 weeks ago today. So I took the sling off for this, but recovering, it takes a while, but it's okay. So we weren't doing anything, a whole lot of things right away. But in the next couple of weeks, I'm doing a number of appearances. I love to go to bookstores, because I love to go to bookstore.
Hmm.
I'm one of these guys that'll walk in and hang out and read some things, and I'll always walk out with an armful of books, no matter where I am. I might be in London doing something. I'm going to be in London books. I'm walking out with their books afterwards. So we've got a few that we're doing here locally on the Jersey Shore where I live. So with Barnes and Noble in Monmouth Mall in Eatontown, New Jersey on this coming Saturday, the 6th. On the 9th, we have a marvelous bookstore. The town I live in is called Spring Lake. It's a small town, 3,000 people, right on the ocean, and a little street, little kind of main street, and it's always written up as this lovely picturesque town. And we have a fairly new bookstore there called Thunder Books, and they've been wonderful. They have just kind of built out. They moved into new space. The community has been supportive. So Monday night on the 9th, I'm there in Spring Lake. In July 13th, the neighboring town is called Brielle, and the Brielle Library, Public Library, is hosting. We're going to do a conversation with myself and one of my good friends who's in the media also about that. We've got a number of things that are being set up. As a matter of fact, I've communicated with the person who runs all of the marketing publicity at Kensington, and Vita Ekstrand just does a fabulous job. And we're setting up things. So we'll do a trip to Philadelphia, DC, a couple of great stops in Delaware, like Rehoboth Beach and some other
Right.
things. This will be like July and August. I'm going to try and get up in your area, around the Boston area. I'm hoping we're looking to set up something hopefully at Smith College, where, as I said, Lee Carson was enrolled as a 14-year-old.
Hmm.
And I thought, Smith College, originally one of the 7 sister schools that were all
Hmm.
women, still one of the handful of all women schools. And my hope is, I said, let's talk about somebody who came from your environments, and let
Hmm.
your students today hear about groundbreakers. So we're looking for a couple of those places. up in Hanover, New Hampshire, there's a great True North, I think it's called, bookstore up there that we're looking to talk to. So the whole bunch of them we're looking to. So any of you out there have fun bookstores and like to come, let us know. I'd love to do it.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you. I'm sorry to take up so much of your time. We could get, I think
this was a delight.
Chatting for another hour.
No, you and I could have gone forever. This was this was a delightful, and you know why it was delightful? Because it wasn't an interview; it was a conversation that you and I had, which makes it so enjoyable, I think.
Yeah, well, hopefully we'll get to meet in person sometime. Thank you. I wish you all the best. Again, it is Beyond This Place of Wrath and Tears. And that's a wrap. So next up on Thursday night, I have my friend Camille DeMeo with her, I think it's her 8th novel, Come Fly With Me, which just came out. And you can register at janehealy.com. Thank you so much. My mom says this was the best ever. So
well, if it comes from your mom, then I deeply appreciate that, because moms know.
Moms know. All right. Have a great night and best of luck, Jack. Thank you so much.
Thanks again, Jane. You be well.
Take care. Bye-bye.